Hi class, welcome to the second week of this summer class. Congratulations for making it through the first week. I hope you've been finding everything, all the resources useful, and I hope your homeworks have been going well. I strongly advise that you do not wait until the last minute to do your homework, so try to get on it as quickly as possible, so that you're not lagging behind. And as usual, if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to send me an email and I'll try to schedule an online meeting, right, to help you out. So yeah, this week we're going to be learning, covering chapters 4 to 6, and quickly, let's get into chapter 4. So I briefly introduced demand and supply earlier on, but basically, who makes the demand, who is the supplier, Basically, when it comes to goods and services, say for instance, groceries, right? The shoes we wear, the clothes we wear, all of that goods and services market. We, households are the consumers and we're the ones that demand for these goods and services. And then the firms or the business people are the ones who supply, right? But when it comes to the job market, so when it comes to working, it's the opposite. In the job market, we, the household, supply the labor, right? So we supply the labor, and in return, we get wages from the firms and the businesses, right? Who demand our labor, right? Okay, so that's a brief introduction on that. So quickly, what is a market? A market is any place, physically or online, that people, the buyers and the sellers meet in order to exchange goods and services in return for money, right? So, as we know, there are so many digital markets now. We have Amazon, we have Shein, we have Temu, and as well as physical markets like, Walmart or like even garage sale. That's a good example of a market too. So there are different kinds of market, right? So there's something called competitive markets and non-competitive markets. So as the name implies, a competitive market is where there is a lot of competition, right, between the buyers and the sellers, so that one buyer or one seller cannot control the market or the price, right? So on the very extreme, we have something called the perfect competition. All right, so this is the perfect competition, and this is an imaginary market. It's an ideal, theoretical market that doesn't really exist in reality. But in this market, it's assumed that there are so many buyers and so many sellers. So you have many buyers and sellers, right? As I mentioned, because there are many buyers and sellers, they are price takers, right? So they are price takers, meaning no one person can control the market. So whatever price is determined by the market is what they go with, okay? Something else that also is interesting is this price takers means that the price is determined by the market. So, like, you can't just wake up one morning as a seller and say, oh yeah, I want to change the price of my product, because then what's going to happen is that all your customers are going to switch to all the other many alternatives that they have, right? So you're going to lose out. So the price is dictated by the market and it is fixed. I don't know if you figured this out already, but because there's so many buyers and sellers, what that tells you is that there's free entry and exits, okay? So you have free entry and exits, okay? So anyone can easily, with few resources, few money, little amount of money, they can easily enter the market and exit, okay? And also, because there's so many buyers and so many sellers selling the same product, so right, they sell same or identical products. So there is no difference between what you're buying from seller A and what you're buying from seller B, right? So it's exactly the same product. A good example that I give, again, this is just an ideal world, is pure water, like water, right? So let's assume there was no branding of water like back in the days, water is water. There's no differentiation of, water, right? So that would be like a good example of a perfect competition. So this is one extreme, okay? So the second extreme would be something called monopolistic competition. So this is one. Then the next one is monopolistic competition. So this is quite similar to perfect competition, in that you are still selling the same goods, but you differentiate by branding your products. So take, for example, the water example. There's Aquafina. There's so many types of branded waters, right, that you can get. So same goods and services. I'm just going to say G&S, goods and services, but differentiated. Okay, so it's different as a result of branding. Okay, pretty much there's still free entry and exit. There's still many buyers and sellers. And the only difference now is that there's differentiation of the goods by branding. And what does that mean for price? That means that prices are slightly different. So the prices are not the same, but they just differ by like a couple of cents, for instance, right? So let's take another example of like ramen noodles, right? So noodles, there's different kind of noodles, right? And they're pretty much all like affordable, but like they just differ by like a couple of cents or like $1 or something. So the difference in price is not much. So prices are slightly close, slightly close. Okay. And another example could be that the clothes, the shoes that we buy, it's just a matter of like branding, right? So like a designer cloth would be like way more expensive than a regular clothes, right? But yeah, these are just examples of monopolistic competition. Or like even restaurants. Restaurants sell like food in general, but like they just differentiate with the kind of food and how they make the food. Okay, and so that's one example. These are examples of a imperfect competition. So anything that I'm listing here is going to be, anything from number 2 downwards is going to be imperfect on non-competitive markets, but basically imperfect competition. And another extreme here is what we call oligopoly. So what does oligopoly mean? Oligopoly means that there are few buyers and sellers. Okay, so few buyers meaning you can have like 3 buyers and sellers upwards, so 3, 4, 5, right? But like just a few. A good example is airlines. So for instance, we have Delta Airlines, we have American Airlines, we have Southwest. There are like few airlines that exist in any country, and because of how difficult it is, like the resources and the capital, then we don't have free entry and exit. So entry and exit is a bit more difficult here, right? So it's slightly difficult because of the resources, the high amount of resources needed. So due to costly resources, okay. Again, because they're just like few buyers and sellers, they can dictate the price to an extent. They can influence the price. So there's some kind of price influence going on, right? But again, imagine like we have airlines, right? Let's say we have like 5 or 7 airlines in the United States, for instance. These few markets have to do like some kind of collaboration where they can charge a little bit higher prices, but the difference between the prices that they're charging is not going to be much. Okay, so it's also based on like price discrimination, where they have like different price categories for different kinds of customers, right? So for the richer customers, they would have like, for instance, the first class, right? There's a different price for first class, different price for economy, right? But there's slight differences across the airlines. So that is that about oligopoly. Something else that I want to emphasize is, so oligopoly means few sellers, right? Actually, oligopoly means few sellers, and then oligopsony means few buyers. Okay, so these few buyers often relate to things that are bought land, in large quantities, like for instance agricultural products, or coffee beans, all of that. So which companies are big enough to buy like all these huge natural resources in large quantities? So like Amazon could be a good example. Amazon, FedEx, Walmart, these are like companies that buy like raw materials or like natural products that they can resell. They buy it in bulk, and then they can resell it and they have the markets pretty much under their control, right? So the next extreme would be duopoly. So if oligopoly means few sellers, what does duopoly mean? 2 sellers. Okay. So oligopoly is few sellers, duopoly is 2 sellers. Okay. A popular example is, if you don't have an Android, what's the next option for the phone? An iPhone, right? So it's either Android phone or iPhone, right? Then there's also what we call duopsony, which means 2 buyers. All right, so these are just examples of imperfect competition. But like once you leave monopolistic competition, oligopoly, duopoly, oligopsony, duopsony, and the next one I'm going to talk about is monopoly and monopsony, right? So, but like all these oligopoly, oligopsony, duopoly, duopsony, monopoly, monopsony, all of these ones are not competition, like non-competitive markets. So there's no competition between numbers 3, 4, 5. Okay, so monopoly means 1 seller. And a good example is MLGW. I hope you can still see that. So MLGW is a good example, or like even people that mine for natural resources like gold and all of that, because it takes a lot of resources to be able to extract, gold and oil from underneath the ground. So like that would be a very good example of a monopoly, right? And same thing, monopsony is just when there's only one buyer, right? So most times, if there's going to be like only one buyer for a certain kind of good, say for instance like patents is like when you give exclusive rights to a company to be able to produce something, right? So most times it's going to be the government. So government is the only entity that is big enough to be like a sole buyer for any particular good or service, right? Okay, so these are examples of competitive markets. Remember, number 2, monopolistic competition is an imperfect competitive market, right? But from numbers 3 to 5 are non-competitive markets. Okay, so the next one I want to talk about is the law of demand and supply. So what is demand? So I already explained that in the regular market for goods and services, we, the household and individuals, are the demanders for the good and the consumers of the good, right? So the law of demand simply states, law of demand, I'm going to call demand DD. It simply states that the higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded. Okay, so that means there is a negative relationship between price and quantity demanded. And mostly that applies to all goods. Now, we're going to talk about the exceptions in a bit, okay? The exceptions to the law of demand in a bit. So there's also something called a demand schedule. A demand schedule is simply a table that shows the relationship between price and quantity demanded. So let me give an example. So let's say we have price and we have quantity, right? So at $1, let's assume we're looking at oranges, right? So let's assume the good is oranges. Okay, so let's say at $1 we have 20 oranges being demanded. So this is just an example. At $2 we have, let's say, 17 oranges demanded. At $3 we have, let's say, 12 oranges demanded. And at $4, let's say we only have like 3 oranges demanded, right? So basically, this table is showing that the higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded. So this is what they call a demand schedule. Now, there's the next thing is a demand graph. So a graph, a demand curve. So this demand curve is going to show the relationship between price and quantity demanded. So usually price is on the y-axis and quantity is on the x-axis. So let's plot this together. At $0, we know that there's 0 quantity demanded, right? At $1, we know that we have as much as 20 goods demanded, okay? And then at $2, we have 17. And at $3, we have 12 goods demanded. And at $4, we have just 3 goods demanded, right? So basically for a demand curve, all you have to do is connect these lines together, okay? Don't have the best artistic skills. But yeah, connecting these dots together, right? So this is how your demand curve looks like. So your demand curve is just a graph. So it's a graph that is showing the relationship between the inverse relationship. So remember, it's an inverse relationship, it's a negative relationship. So a demand curve shows the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded, okay? Now, something else I forgot to mention is anytime you're interpreting, so like the higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded, ceteris paribus. So ceteris paribus means all other things being equal. So all other things meaning it's not only price that affects the demand for a good, right? So other things such as income, such as your taste, such as your preferences, influence the quantity demanded for the good, okay? So that is that on the law of demand. The law of supply is opposite. The law of supply simply says the higher the price, the higher the quantity supplied. So higher price, higher quantity supplied, okay? And what does that mean? That just simply means a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. So think from the perspective of a producer. You want to make profit, so you're willing to supply more goods at a higher price, you know, because that's the way you make more money. All right, and there is something that I want to emphasize. So there is shifters of demand and supply, and then there is movers. So basically, a mover of demand and supply simply means that only the change in price of that good or tax would lead to a movement along the demand curve, right? So when the price of the good changes, or when there's a tax that changes the price of the good, that is when you have a movement along the demand curve. So for instance, let's say there's a tax imposed that increases the price from $1 to $2, right? So then you see how the demand curve is going to move from point A to point B, okay? So you see that movement right here. So that is a demand mover, right? A supply mover would be things like the changes in the input price or the changes in the cost of production, right? So that would affect how much the sellers are willing to sell the product, right? So that is just going to be the opposite. So let's first of all talk about a supply schedule. So a supply schedule is basically the relationship between price and quantity supplied, okay? So at $1, let's say they're willing to supply 3 goods. At $2, they're willing to supply 8 goods. At $3, they're willing to supply as much as 20 goods. Okay, because they're trying to make their profits. So at $0, so remember you have your price on the y-axis and you have your quantity supplied on the x-axis. So at $1, you have 3 units being supplied, right? And at $2, you have 8 units being supplied. And at $3, you have 20 units being supplied. So can you see that this is sloping upwards? So this is your supply and this is your demand. Okay, so this is your supply curve. It has a positive relationship, as you can see. But something you should note is that the lowest point of your supply curve is usually the cost of production. Okay, so this point here is your cost of production. Now, what are the demand or the supply shifters? So the demand shifters would be anything apart from price of that product that causes demand to change. So we talked about it. I mentioned it. So income, right? So if you earn more income, let's say when you graduate, and now you're working class and you're no longer a student, you're going to earn more income, right? So automatically you would demand for more goods and services that you were demanding for as a student. So that's an example of a demand shifter. How about changes in taste, right? Your taste, your preferences. So whatever you have more taste and preferences for is what you demand more of, right? And how about like season? So for instance, where like this is summer, right? So this is not the time to be buying like raincoats and jackets and umbrellas and all of that because it's hot. So instead you would want to buy like skimpy dresses and everything so you don't feel hot, right? So the season also influences your demand for a good and service. And also there's government policy, right? So if a government bans a product, you can't demand for that good any longer, right? So these are all examples of demand shifters. So let's go back to income. Usually there's a positive relationship between income and your demand. So notice that whenever anything apart from price changes, that is called a change in demand. So also when you expect, you anticipate that there's going to be a change in price. So for instance, you anticipate that the price of a good is going to increase. Then what's going to happen is that you're going to increase your demand for that good right now so that you don't have to spend more money in the future to buy the good, right? So when there's an anticipated change in the price of a good, then that also shifts the demand curve to the left or right. So income has a positive relationship. So the higher the income, the higher the demand, right? So your demand curve is going to shift from this point, for instance, is going to shift outward to the right. Okay, so you're going to have another curve called D1, right? So this is an example of a price shifter. Same thing, expected change in price. If you expect that the price of a good in the future is going to increase, you're going to increase your demand for the good right now, right? So that would mean that your demand for the good is also going to shift to the right. However, for an inferior good, it's just the exact opposite of a normal good. So an inferior good means that the more income you earn, the less of the good that you demand. And the less income you earn, the more of the good that you demand. So for instance, let's say as students, we don't have so much money, or you're broke most of the time, then you are likely to demand more of like ramen noodles or potatoes or burgers, french fries, all of those like cheap, affordable goods. So you have less income and you're demanding more of those, cheap, affordable goods, right? So that is an inferior good. And for that case, your demand is going to shift to the right. Your demand is going to shift to the right, right? But now, let's say, you become working class, you're earning more, and so you can afford to, you most likely would not be buying so much cheap goods. You would rather take yourself out to a restaurant and buy something, nice and fancy. So in that case, your demand for, an inferior good is going to come down, right? So your demand is going to shift to the left. So that is a quick example of normal versus inferior goods and how they shift the demand curve, either to the left or to the right. Now, another example is prices of related goods, okay? So income, season, taste, government policies, expected changes in price, and prices of related goods. Prices of related goods, I'm just going to say RJ, related goods, okay? So that also would shift your demand curve. So for instance, the related goods include substitutes, right? So substitutes are goods that you can either have one or the other. So for instance, pen or pencil. You can't use a pen and pencil at the same time to write. You have to choose either use a pen or use a pencil. Another example of a substitute is either you use a digital book or use a physical book. Another example of that is that either use a car or use a bicycle. So these are all examples of substitutes. You can give other examples that you know of. But basically, for substitute goods, when the price of good X increases, according to the law of demand, the quantity of good X is going to reduce. Quantity of good X is going to reduce. But what does that mean for the price of the substitute goods? So let's say we're looking at tea and coffee, right? So let's say good X is for tea. Okay, so if the price of tea increases, the quantity demanded of tea is going to reduce, and people are going to switch to the substitute, which is coffee, right? So people are now going to demand more quantity of good Y, you understand, which is coffee. So you see that for substitute goods, there is a positive relationship. So there's a positive relationship for substitute goods. And complementary goods are things that you order together. So like a shirt and a pant, right? You order both of them together, it's complementary. You go car and gasoline. You can mention any other example that you can think of. Like you go into the movies, you're going to most likely want popcorn. So movie and popcorn would go together, or like a pencil and eraser, or like some chips and some sauce, right? So all of these are complements, right? So for complement, there is a negative relationship between the price of one good and the quantity demanded of the other good. So let's say we're using pencil and eraser, right? So the higher the price of the pencil, the lower the quantity of the pencil, right? But at the same time, because pencils and erasers go together, then you're also going to demand less of the eraser, right? So there's a negative relationship between the price of one good and the relationship of the other good for a complement good, okay? And now what is equilibrium quantity and supply?